Washington, D.C., the central hub of power in this country, they want even more of it. They're moving for statehood now, meaning Washington, D.C., as we know, it's a federal district. It's the District of Columbia, where the seat of our government is. We have the Congress there, the Senate, the House of Representatives, the judge, the judiciary, the Supreme Court. Most of our government is there, including the White House. Most of the executive branch is there. If you've ever been to D.C., it's a beautiful little town, but it is very powerful. A lot of people there. And so they have been clamoring for some time to get more of it. They want to be a state. They want to get statehood. Why do they want to do that? Well, for a number of different reasons. And I think we're going to break that down as we go through this. But let me start off sort of high level. I want to show you this clip of Mayor Bowser, who is the mayor of Washington, D.C. She's not happy with the Republican arguments about why Washington, D.C. should not be a state. And we're going to go through a lot of this. We're going to talk about the Constitution. We're going to talk about the founding of the Constitution, about one particular clause that exists in there and how that came to be. Then we're going to take a look at the 23rd Amendment. We're also going to, we've got a lot to get to. So let's just get right into it. Here is Mayor Bowser. She's on MSNBC. This was a couple days ago. And she's having a conversation about how dumb the Republicans are. They have all of these objections about why Washington, D.C. should not be a state. And she's saying those are just really dumb arguments. They don't even make any sense. And here's why. And then we're going to break down and sort of respond to her argument. So here she is on MSNBC.
Their arguments they're stupid, and they show that they have run out of, and we have debunked all of the arguments they used to use against us. It's not constitutional. Well, H.R. 51 makes clear we're still going to have a federal district. We're too small. We're bigger than 2 states and almost as big as 7. We can't govern ourselves, and we have one of the best run jurisdictions, great economy, and economy's coming back of all the jurisdictions in the nation. So we're very proud of what we can do. So they're left with their simple partisan arguments that I argued yesterday were rooted in the history of race. And it is a demonstration that people have long been concerned about the black political power that we've developed in Washington, D.C.
All right. So your arguments are stupid and they're racist. Got it. So that's pretty much the nuts and bolts of that argument. She does reference H.R. 51. We're going to talk about that. But let's go to the Constitution. Let's go to the rules. What is this? What does our founding document say about statehood and how this stuff works? We can go right to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 says that Congress shall have the power to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district not exceeding 10 miles square as may by session of particular states in the acceptance of Congress become a seat of the government of the United States, and to exercise like authority over all places purchased by consent of the legislature of the state in which the same shall be for the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings. So this is a very, very difficult clause to sort of break down. But essentially what it's saying is that it's creating this, it's called the enclave clause. It's a federal seat of government, and it's something that is specifically carved out, and there are some pretty clear rules on how this stuff works. And so let's go through and look at the history of this. Why did this come about? Why did our founders specifically put that in there? Seems kind of weird. Why do we have a federal district that has some government? I mean, they thought this through. They just didn't sort of, slap Washington, D.C. on a map and say, well, we're just going to put everybody there. A lot of forethought went into this. Let's break it down. Seat of the government. So during the Constitutional Convention, the convention was moved to provide for the it was moved, meaning somebody asked, move, like filed a motion. They moved for the creation of a site in which to locate the capital of the nation. So they actually brought this up. Where's the capital of the nation going to be? They say it needs to be completely removed from the control of any state because of the humiliation suffered by the Continental Congress on June 21st, 1783. 80 soldiers, unpaid and weary, marched on the Congress that was sitting in Philadelphia, physically threatened and verbally abused the members, and caused the Congress to flee the city when neither municipal nor state authorities would take action to protect the members. So the states didn't protect the Congress, so they said, screw that then. We're going to create our own federal district, and we're going to house ourselves there. Madison noted, quote, the indispensable necessity of complete authority at the seat of government carries its own evidence with it. Without it, not only the public authority might be insulted and its proceedings interrupted with impunity, but a dependence on the members of the general government on the state comprehending the seat of government for protection in the exercise of their duty might bring on national counsel and imputation of awe or influence equally dishonorable to the government and dissatisfactory to the other members of the Confederacy. So what Madison is saying is, yes, we need a strong national seat for the government, because if the national government is sort of subservient to the state governments, if the national government is relying on, as we saw that happened in 1783, if they're relying on Philadelphia or the state of Pennsylvania to protect them, well, we see how that doesn't work. And that might happen again today. So they said, all right, look, if we're going to have this powerful central government, we got to have a place to hold it. And so they're going to be seating it in Washington, D.C. The actual site was then selected by compromise, Northerners accepting the southern favorite site on the Potomac, in return for the southern support for Northern aspiration, assumption of Revolutionary War debts by the national government. So they all just sort of met together. They established a circuit court, provided for the appointment of judicial and law enforcement officials. They divided it into two counties, Washington and Alexandria. Local laws of the two states said that they should continue in effect. And so there was some additional conversation here. Let's go on to the 23rd Amendment. So this all took place back in 1783 when they were having this conversation. So the Congress sort of got insulted. They modified things, created this national seat of government, and then there was also consideration, or there seems to have been no consideration given at the convention or in the ratifying conventions about the question of the governance of the district. There was an effort by constitutional amendment to confer voting representation in the House and the Senate, and that failed of ratification. So let's talk about the 23rd Amendment first. Then we're going to talk about the prior attempt. So there's been multiple attempts to get Washington, D.C. into statehood status-ish. And the 23rd Amendment gave them the ability to vote in presidential elections. So let's take a look at this one. 23rd Amendment of the United States extends the right to vote in presidential elections to citizens residing in D.C. It grants the district electors in the Electoral College as though it were a state, though the district can never have more electors than the least populous state. And so right now those are Wyoming and I think Vermont and Alaska. I think those are 3. So they can't have more than 3. So DC gets 3. 23rd Amendment was proposed by the 86th Congress on June 1960, was ratified on 1961. So DC can vote in presidential elections. Each state receives, so this tells you about how these are calculated. The way that electoral votes are calculated, it's the number of senators plus the number of representatives. And so, for Alaska, they have 2 senators and 1 elected representative, so they get 3 votes. First presidential election in which D.C. participated was in 1964. And the 23rd Amendment did not grant the district voting rights in Congress, nor did it give the district the right to participate in the process that allows the Constitution to be amended, nor did it grant the district home rule. An unsuccessful proposed constitutional amendment to do this failed in 1978. Many citizens of the district favor statehood or further constitutional amendment to address these issues. And so the 23rd Amendment comes in, gives them the right to vote. That happens in the 1960s. The first time that they can vote for president is during the 1964 election. And then now the next step is to say, well, what about senators now? Maybe we want 2 additional senators. Maybe we want additional representatives so that they can have a say in the Congress just like a regular state would. What was the political impact of the 23rd Amendment? Let's take a look. While perceived as politically neutral and somewhat liberal leaning at the time of passage in 61, the district swung dramatically toward the Democratic Party in the years after passage. African Americans voted in greater numbers. 71% of the federal district was black, a dramatic jump. In line with black voters' strong support for Democrats, the district has sent its 3 electoral votes to the Democratic candidate in every single presidential election since 1964, including the 1984 landslide re-election of President Reagan, where only D.C. and Minnesota voted for Mondale. The electoral votes have never been proven decisive. The smallest victory was in Jimmy Carter's 57-vote win in 1976. So unaddressed are the 23rd Amendment issues were congressional representation. Congress approved that. Let's see what else we have. The campaign. All right, so we know what the effects of this are. and I think this really sort of answers the question about why they are so gung-ho about getting this passed, and it's because they'll have more representation in Congress. Right now, the Senate is split, right? It's 50-50. They have the tiebreaker in Kamala Harris, who is the 51st vote. So the Democrats are in control of the Senate, but if they get a state now, well, they just add 2 senators to that list. It's pretty good. Good way to make sure that you secure power, especially when never have they ever voted for a Republican. Never. Not ever. Not one time. So it's kind of I think a solidification of their force in the country. And the alternative opinion on that is, okay, so what? They deserve representation, right? They are citizens too. Why don't they get a special say? You can split. You can make arguments for and against that. And so we heard from Mayor Bowser, and she was referencing this bill, the H.R. 51 Washington D.C. Admission Act. We can see that this was just introduced into the House, has not been passed the Senate or passed the House yet. Here's a summary of the bill. It says this bill provides for admission into the United States, the state of Washington, Douglas Commonwealth, composed of most of the territory of D.C. Commonwealth shall be admitted on equal footing to other states. Mayor of D.C. shall issue a proclamation for the first elections of 2 senators and 1 representative of the Commonwealth. The bill applies to district laws, the Commonwealth, and pending judicial proceedings. It's going to be a distinct territory with specified exclusions for federal buildings and monuments, including the principal federal monuments, White House, Capitol Building, and so on. They may not impose taxes on federal property. D.C. is going to be excluded. The district territory excluded from the Commonwealth shall be known as the capital and shall be the seat of the federal government. So what they're trying to do is comply with that clause 17 under Article 1, saying the seat of federal government. So they can't disturb that because the Constitution says so. So they're trying to modify this and get this passed. Looks like they're probably going to try to get this passed without a constitutional amendment. The bill maintains the federal government's authority over the military lands. The bill provides for expedited consideration, a joint resolution, repealing the 23rd Amendment, which provides for the appointment of electors. And this is interesting because I had a question about how that would interface with the 23rd Amendment. If they were granted statehood, then they wouldn't need the 23rd Amendment to grant them electoral votes to vote for president. But if they're a state, they won't need that anymore, but it would conflict with that. So they would have to repeal that simultaneously, which is what this bill intends to do. And so they want to repeal a constitutional amendment. So I think they would have to get this through on a constitutional amendment. Establishes the State Transition Commission, certain federal responsibilities, blah, blah, blah. All right, so that's where that is. Now, this was attempted previously. So if you look back here, HJ Resolution 554 back in the 95th Congress, 1977 to 1978, you can see here that the latest action was on September 6, 1978. Having been passed by 2/3 in each chamber, this proposed amendment to the Constitution was sent to the states for ratification. It was ratified by 16 states, but expired in 1985 without receiving ratification of the required 38 states. So they couldn't do it. This was a joint resolution to amend the Constitution to provide for representation for D.C. So this has been attempted before, and it's not gone anywhere. Right. All right. So here's DC statehood amendment. What's needed? You got to have 2/3 of the House of Representatives in the Senate for a constitutional amendment. Then you got to have 3/4 of the states to ratify that. And that's where that last bill failed. It passed 2/3 of the House and the Senate, but 2/3 of the states didn't ratify it. They would get 2 senators and they would get 1 representatives, and they would almost certainly be Democrats, as we have seen from the voting history in D.C., which is why you can see why Democrats are so gung-ho about getting this in play. Now, I have a little bit of an alternative solution on this thing, and I like this idea in theory, and I'm sure there's a million reasons why this idea is would not work, but I like it in theory, and I want to just share it with you. I think it's kind of a fun idea to experiment with. So we're talking about representation in this country. We're talking about certain people not being represented. People in D.C. don't feel like they're represented. People in the regular states may feel like they're not properly represented. And there's a good argument that they're not. And I want to show you how that argument unfolds. So let's take a look. Let's rewind the clock a little bit. Let's go back to 1790, when this country was just in its infancy. What did representation look like? In other words, I'm a citizen in 1790. What does my representation look like? How big of the pie of representation do I get? We know that there's one pie. Can't really make it bigger or smaller because we have a certain number of people in this country. We have a certain government in this country. So we have a ratio between the people who need the representation and the government that represents us. What does that relationship look like? How big of the representation pie do I get? Let's break this down. In 1790, this is what happened under the Constitution. It set the number of representatives at 65. So when the country was first founded, we had 65 representatives. So in the House of Representatives, this comes over from the census.gov website. I have the link to this article in the slides. 1787, 65 representatives until the first enumeration in 1790. The first apportionment based on the 1790 census resulted in 105 members. So the House in 3 years went from 65 to 105 representatives. From 1800 to 1840, the number of representatives was determined by the ratio of the number of persons each was to represent, a fixed ratio, although the way to handle fractional remainders changed. Therefore, it changed as that ratio as well as population grew, and on and on and on. Okay, then they fixed it in 1911. It was fixed at 433. That gave us provisions for Arizona and New Mexico when they became states. Then it got fixed at 435. There was a temporary increase to 437, and it's really remained unchanged since 1911. So it's been 435. So we know that if we rewind the clock, so today in 2021, it is still 435 members. In 1790, we had 105 members. So let's do some math on this as it relates to the population. Okay, so in 1790, how many people were in the country? We know that we had 105 representatives. How many people were there? So what portion of your representative did you get? What portion of the pie was on your plate based on that ratio? So let's take a look at the census from 1790. In 1790, there were 3.9 million people in the country. Now, you can see these numbers kind of get messy because we're talking about slaves and there's the 3/5 rule and there's also, who qualifies as a citizen, who qualifies as a resident, really what is your representation, blah, blah, blah. Not even going to focus on any of that. We're going to say everybody gets representation. So the U.S. resident population, anybody who is residing in the country, we're going to give them all representation. Yes, technically I know that there were slaves that did not get representation and the slave owners got 3/5, got some representation on the backs of the slaves. I get it, but we're just going to give everybody representation the way that it should have been, right? Everybody should have been free, and living in a representative democracy, they all get representation. So we're going to pick that big number, 3.9 million people, residents, according to the 1790 census, counting everybody. All right, so let's do the ratio. What is the proportion here? In 1790, we can see that we have 3.9 million people. This number here, there were 105 representatives. And so every representative was representing 37,419 people. So it's one representative for every 37,000 people. Well, today, if you look up our population, you're going to see in 2021, we fast forward quite a bit, we have 330 million Americans, residents, let's say, according to the census, according to estimates on the internet. And now we only have 435 representatives. Okay, so it's gone up, but not much. So that ratio looks like now we have one representative for every 758,000 people. So it used to be one person for every 37,000. Now we have one representative for every 758,000. Okay, and so you can see that this is just diluting your share of representation. Every time that the population explodes and our representatives stay the same, your share of representation gets smaller. It's inflation. It's representation inflation. You have a smaller piece, the bigger the country gets, the same size of the House of Representatives doesn't change. Neither does the Senate. So every year that goes by, your share of representation goes down. So what I would like to do is go back to that original ratio. Let's go back to 1 to 37,500 people. This was good enough for the founders. In 1790, they said 1 to 37,000 was about right. That's why we got 105 representatives in the House. Now it's 1 to 758,000. So let's increase that ratio. Let's expand the House of Representatives to give us back our representation because it's been taken away from us over the last 100 years, over 100 years, has not changed since 1911. So everybody needs a little bit more representation. What would this look like, practically speaking? This is where people are going to go, I'm out. I like the idea, but I'm out. No thanks. Let's do some math on this. We're going to throw this into a calculator. So we can do a simple ratio solver. We can put over here 3,929,000 people divided by 105 representatives. If we put the top number over here at C, 330 million Americans, 159,000 residents, how many representatives would we need in subbox D to mirror the same number of representatives? Remember, right now we have 435. So if we wanted to have the same level of representation, we need 8,800 representatives in this country. Okay, 8,823 to be specific. So we need 8,823 representatives in our Congress in order to give us the representation that we're due. We don't have that. We have 435 right now. Almost 1 to a million. 1 to about 700, 1 to 3/4 people. Used to be 1 to 37,000. What would it look like in Arizona? In Arizona, we have, I think, 9 representatives here. 9. We have 9. In Arizona, if you did the math, you would say 3.9 million to 105 representatives. So if we have 7.42 million, we would need 198 representatives. We would need almost 200 representatives to have that same representation threshold. Right now, what we have, folks, is representation inflation. You have a much, much less significant share of representation in this country. Hasn't changed in over 100 years, since 1911. Maybe it's time to rethink that a little bit. Now, here's what I would like to do. I would like to say we restore real representation. Okay, we restore the representation. We increase the total number of representatives to 8,800. Goes up from 435 to 8,800 plus. That's subject to change based on the population growth in this country. We declare Washington, D.C. a historic district. So we keep it as the seat of our government. That complies with the Constitution. But we just say this is a historic district. We're not doing business here anymore. Okay, you're all working from home. We've been on lockdown for a year. You all know how to work remotely. We don't need to have everybody there in D.C. anymore. It's become this cesspool. It's become a swamp of corruption and greed and lobbyists. And it has some of the most awful people in the country there because they're all fighting over power. So we want to declare it a historic district and we want to decentralize governmental operations. We want to say, no, you don't need to all be there anymore. Why is agriculture in Washington, D.C.? Why don't we put that in the Midwest? Why don't we put the Border Patrol facilities on the border, maybe down there in Donna, Texas? Why do we have everything congregated in Washington, D.C.? It's not necessary anymore. This was a nice container for our country for a couple hundred years. It was a good spot. It was a good thing to do. But we don't need that anymore. We have a digital country. Everything can be done online. We can have 8,800 members who are spread across this country that don't have to travel to DC on a regular basis, that have direct representation or closer representation. It's still a republic. We still have representative democracy, but we are communicating with our representatives. So I can just go right down to my representative's office and say, hey, jerk, what are you doing on this bill? Figure it out, right? I can express my displeasure or my pleasure with my local representative, and I would have a 1 to 37.5 share. Whereas right now I have 1 to 750,000 share. It's much less. And so we would have a lot more representatives. They would be able to form their own little communities, might even break the two-party system because you have enough people now decentralized and spread all across this country who are involved in government. It's more representative. I don't know why we just started capping it at 435. Probably because it was just a procedural issue. It was a practicality problem. We couldn't, back then we couldn't have 8,000 people in a building, but we're mature enough now. Society has matured enough and we need more representation, not less. That's my solution. And so DC could be a part of that. Give them statehood, give them whatever you want, but you just do away with DC in general. It's a historic district. You turn everything into museums. You can still have them live symbolically in the White House. You can still have the congressional building for a State of the Union address, but you don't need it to govern. You don't need any of that stuff. You need actual representation. We want a functional republic, not a symbolic one that doesn't get anything done. Just one idea. Thought it was kind of fun. Let's take some questions quickly. Boom Boom for Love says, it's not a conflict of interest to allow statehood when it will be a solid lock for Democrats from here to eternity. I think it is a conflict of interest. They don't care, though. They know that this is how this works. CA Java Bean says, if meaningful representation of citizens is really their interest, will they commit to supporting statehood for rural regions and blue states who similarly feel they are without representation, as those new states would likely lean red? Great question, Java Bean. Actually, it's a great question. I've been thinking about this in the context of California. My understanding is there's a proposal that basically wants to split that up into 3 states, which... yeah, it's more representation. We want more representation. We want more ability to be represented by our governments. And if you sort of took my proposal right now, California is Democrat across the board because they have the hold on those areas, those seats. But if you said, hey, yeah, for California, but you're going to be getting, I don't know. They got a ton of people, run the numbers on it. You're going to get another 1,000 representatives. Those people in those red areas, they would get representation. They currently don't have it because there's a tyranny of the majority going on. But you decentralize it, you give people more options, and so they may still not, win. They may not ever have the majority, but they'll have a better voice in Congress, which are currently being gobbled up by the Democrats, by the major population centers. Good question, though. We have Chairman of the Board says, if they are concerned about representation, why not give them back land to Maryland and Virginia and make them residents of those states and leave the minimum amount of land as D.C. is required by the Constitution? Have that be the federal buildings as required to do business. Any homes in that area may be temporary for people in office with a primary residence elsewhere. Yeah, so they're not concerned about representation. They're concerned about political power. That's why they want those additional senators. All right. And our last question on this, again, questions come from locals.com/watchingthewatchers. Jack Alaya says, will representation actually improve at the point where members of the House will no longer be able to communicate and persuade one another due to time constraints concerning their posits? So I think that I'm not real sure that I know the answer to that question. I would imagine that they could communicate and they could, have conversations and have debates in the same way that anybody who's a part of a large organization does. Just because there's a lot of people doesn't mean that you can't communicate. I mean, you still have a process. Everybody gets to sort of weigh in on things. You have debates. You still have the same committees. You just have, sort of multiple layers of that. You flesh out a hierarchy that's much bigger. And part of the feature of this system is that nothing gets done. Yeah, a lot less stuff, I would imagine, gets done, which is great. Because the government's terrible at things. Look what happened with the border. They come in, they're going to do a bunch of stuff. It's a disaster. Government's terrible at solving problems. That's not what it's for. It's terrible at it. So just an idea. Thought it was kind of fun.